Hi, everyone. My name is Brett Hancock. So this is a good question. There are so many denominations of Christianity and interpretations of the Old Testament, which the Jews would call the Tanakh. It's an acronym for the Torah and basically in Hebrew. So basically, the parts of the Bible in Hebrew, it makes up this acronym. But basically, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, the wisdom literature. Um, and so, yeah, this Old Testament, which testament means covenant, like the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. Um, and so, what's the best way to study the Bible? Like all the different denominations, like how can we know what the truth is? So I'm just going to give you my view, my interpretation of this. Obviously, that's all we can do. Everybody's going to have their own opinion. Um, and then what was the faith in early church history? Like to me, like this is the key. Because most people think that, oh, I just read the Bible and I can understand it. And I can tell you by studying languages. I just came back from Israel in late June and did a master's in ancient philology. And there's a lot of linguistics, a lot of language study, looking at the mechanics of languages in that program, and learning different languages, Spanish, Japanese, before I ever learned ancient Greek, New Testament Greek, and Hebrew. It's kind of helped me to see that, recognize, right, just in English, like every language, like there's the more you spend time with languages at a grammatical level and the mechanics of them or whatever, or at least from my experience, you can see that somebody can say something and be understood different ways. And this is why when you're in a conversation with somebody, sometimes somebody's, well, what do you mean by that? You can, and then somebody has to explain what they mean by that. And when you have that benefit of that question and answer with somebody, you can get clarity. But when we have just, say, for instance, the New Testament or the whole Bible, really, but when there's uh, uh, a monologue, one-sided conversation, which all the epistles, all the letters from the apostles are that way, you don't have an opportunity to ask questions and like, okay, what did you mean by that? Because many sentences, many things that somebody might say, things that somebody might write, some things can be understood multiple ways. Some things are just crystal clear. It's like, okay, the sky is blue. There's not a lot of interpretations there, right? But somebody could say something like Jesus saying, if you keep my commandments, then you really love me. And that's what he says in John 14 and 15, a couple different ways. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? Keep my commandments. Like, I think he means this. And somebody, well, I think he means this. And then this means that you love him and all that kind of exchange and debate. And it leads to different denominations of Christianity and interpretations and stuff for a lot of things that were said. So, like, to me, what has really helped me is starting with studying the early church writings. The Ante-Nicene Fathers is the label that was given to them when they were published in the mid 1800s. They were translated back then. So the English sometimes a little bit archaic. Some of those writings were in ancient Greek. Some of the later writings, say the third century writings, were in Latin. I think the first writings that were in Latin would be by Tertullian, which would be volume 3 or 4, I think, of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. But that was in Latin. That was Carthage, North Africa, is where he was. Cyprian later on in the mid 200s, 250, was same region. And so a lot of these guys are writing in Latin, and it's being translated in English. So the writings were a combination of Greek and Latin, and they take you up to about 300, maybe a little bit after 300. That's the Latin word anti, or even somebody speaks Spanish, ante, or whatever. But before the Council of Nicaea, that's why it's called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And so reading those writings, the first few volumes, reading them again and again, which is the earliest writings. Volume 1 is the earliest writings, start dating from late first century, which is when apostles are still alive, sweeping through all the way into the second century. First few volumes are that way. And many of those writers knew the apostles personally, right? So they had the opportunity to, ask these questions like, what did you mean by that? Are you saying, this or whatever? And he said, well, I didn't mean that, whatever. You can get clarity, right? And these guys were able to do that. And so when they're writing it from a different angle, as they understood it, that gives us, when you're looking at just a cube, for instance, and just from the front, and you just see a two-dimensional object, you can't actually see three dimensions. You can't see around this side or the back or the bottom or whatever. you don't know it's a cube. You just see it. Maybe it's just a square, right? So so anyway, I think that's the place to start, and then also studying the biblical languages really helped me also to see things. So Greek and Hebrew, and so what? Also, last question: what evidence do we have of how they understood the early scriptures? So that's what I'm saying. The evidence is right there in their writings. They're quoting from the scriptures. Some scholars, a lot of scholars, will say that if you look at the 10-volume set of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, which again spans from the late first century to the early part of the fourth century, there's over 1 million, they say, quotes from the scriptures. So there's a lot of quoting of the scriptures, a lot of explanation of how they understood it. There's a lot of repetition in the understanding of those things, which I would argue is evidence that they had the apostolic, what was handed down by the apostles, because there's so much, they're dispersed all over the ancient world, and yet they're repeatedly explaining things similarly in scattered regions. And then they didn't have the benefit we have today of cell phones and internet for communicating, just picking up the phone to talk to each other. Like, there was a lot of pain and suffering to travel from this region that would be maybe modern day Italy to modern day France to modern day India or Palestine. I mean, where, Israel, to North Africa, to any of these regions. I mean, it was difficult. And then, like Cyprus and some of these islands and stuff, some of these regions you can only get there by water. I mean, to get on a boat and go, it was difficult. There's no planes, there's none of these things. So the fact that they're repeatedly explaining the things in similar language is evidence that this is what the apostles in the first century spread throughout the world, and it was maintained by them. And so this, I think, is the key to really understanding rightly the right exegesis of the scriptures. And so that's how I see it. And then, like I said, the biblical languages can really help as well, bring a lot of clarity. So so I'll stop there. One thing I would like to share real quick, though, is I think it's important to like step through from like an aerial view to look at the scripture, to look at the Old Testament, to start there, right? Start there, like understanding like these events of about 2,000 years in Genesis, and as we move into Exodus, and we look at the whole timeline and the chronology of the Bible, and understand, the chronology, the narrative accounts would be, all the books that are in the Old Testament. There's different genres. So there's narratives where it's an account or it's a record of what actually happened. Genesis is a book like that. Exodus is a book like that. You start to get into other kinds of genre like prophets and Psalms and wisdom literature, whatever. Things like Proverbs would be a very different type of genre. So, but when you look at the narrative, some of the prophets, the books of the prophets, like say Jeremiah, is a mixture of a narrative of things that were happening in his day together with actually prophetic things, forecasting what would happen in the future and stuff. So I just think taking the narrative parts of the Old Testament and then stringing them together chronologically, so that you understand from beginning to end. I think it's really healthy for somebody to be able to, just spit out in a 5 or 10 minute, max 10-minute message, and be able to explain, like, here's the order of events and what happened in the Old Testament, and starting there, right, before we ever try to understand the New Testament message. And then on top of that, in the Old Testament, another layer would be understanding, from the Christian perspective, the ancient Christian perspective, which is somewhat described right in the book of Acts or whatever, and the Gospels and the epistles, really, the different prophecies in the Old Testament that point to the Messiah, that point to, in Hebrew, Mashiach, or in Greek, the Christos, the Christ. And so to understand those, so things like this, stepping through chronologically through the timeline, and here's the period of the United Kingdom, and then as it divided into the divided kingdom, a northern southern kingdom, and I'll take you all the way to the end of the Protestant Bible, up to about 400 BC. So from creation and stuff. So I just think that's really important. And then on top of that, layering messianic prophecies to understand, and then trying to understand the New Testament. Okay, hope that helps you and answers any kind of questions in this regard.